Effective reps, the idea that the last few reps right before you fail are the only reps that really matter for hypertrophy. This is a concept that's gained a lot, and I mean a lot, of popularity in the science-based fitness community over the last year or so, and it's a concept that I actually like. So in February of last year, Dr. 𝐅𝐈𝐓𝐍𝐄𝐒 wrote an article in Alan Aragon's research review formalizing the theory of effective reps, summarizing that while volume is a key driver of hypertrophy, meaning more reps lead to more volume, not all reps are created equal, and that's something I definitely think is true. The basic idea is that the closer a rep is to failure, the more effective it is at building muscle. And at the end of the piece, he laid out some pretty assertive, practical recommendations for effective reps, saying you should do plenty of drop sets and rest-pause sets, where you go to failure, rest for a breath or two, do another few reps, rest for another breath or two, and then do another few reps. Pick an exercise like a machine chest press that you can go to failure on repeatedly, but safely, and even to start replacing normal straight sets with a rest-pause set, drop sets, as you monitor your progress and watch for overtraining. Now, one of the studies that convinced me the most that there probably is something to this idea came from Ghotto and colleagues in 2005. They split subjects into two groups, both doing lat pull downs and leg extensions for sets of 10 reps. The only difference was that group 1 did 10 reps continuously, like you normally would, so 10 reps all the way to failure, while group 2 did the same 10 reps with the same weight, except they rested for 30 seconds halfway through the set, so after the first 5 reps. So just imagine doing 5 reps with your 10 rep max weight, resting 30 seconds, and then doing another 5 reps. The idea was that having that break mid-set would prevent these subjects from reaching failure. So even though the volume and everything else was the same, the group doing 10 reps continuously would get more effective reps because they were going closer to failure. And as it turns out, the group doing the 10 continuous reps saw significantly more growth, so 12.9% growth versus 4% growth in the group resting mid-set. So these results led many people, myself included, to think that maybe those last 5 reps count more for hypertrophy. So for example, if you were to do a set of 15 reps, the last 5 would matter more than the first 10. On a set of 6 reps, the last 5 would matter more than that first rep, and sets with fewer than 5 reps, so let's say a heavy double, even if you go to complete failure, you're still only getting 2 effective reps. Also, it would imply that really high rep sets are not very effective unless taken very close to failure. According to this theory, only the last 5 reps are maximally hypertrophic. So all of the first 25 reps aren't doing much of anything. So imagine if you were to stop at rep 25 because you were tired or you got bored, well, you basically wouldn't have gotten any effective reps for driving muscle growth out of that. Okay, so up until now, all of this has been pretty theoretical. So let's flash forward to today, where Dr. 𝐊𝐀𝐑𝐊𝐄𝐒 gave his take on effective reps on the latest Revive Stronger podcast.
So I think we need a bit more research, and I'll say this. It is true that the closer you get to failure, the more hypertrophic yield each repetition creates. But that's not really a hard cutoff like 6RAR still grows muscle. Probably has what's called an S-curve. Looks like an S on its side. So for really like 15 reps from failure, you have very little growth. And then getting to around 5 reps to failure, you have this inflection point of where growth starts to really go up. What does that mean? That means that training with 4 reps in reserve versus 5 reps in reserve is probably a pretty big difference for hypertrophy. Training with 3 reps in reserve versus 4 reps in reserve is a big difference. Training with 2 reps in reserve versus 3 reps is a decent difference, but nothing crazy. Training with 1 rep in reserve versus 2 reps in reserve is probably a small difference. Training with true failure versus 1 rep in reserve is probably a very small difference.
And in this month's issue of the Mass Research Review, which came out yesterday, there was a summary of a new study from Carroll et al., also suggesting that, well, those last few reps just before failure might matter even less than many people think. So this latest study took 15 well-trained male subjects and split them into a relative intensity group that avoided failure and a rep max group that took more or less the last set of every exercise to failure. At the end of the 10 weeks, they measured quad cross-sectional area and muscle thickness, measured mTOR levels and myosin heavy chain proteins, and to really oversimplify the findings, pretty much saw better trends for hypertrophy in the not to failure group. So here we have a brand new study showing that training all the way to failure may actually be worse for muscle growth. So to understand this, I think we need to quickly look at this paper in the context of the other papers that have also looked at this same question. So basically, as of now, we have 3 studies supporting the idea that failure is better, and 4 studies suggesting that there's no difference between going to failure versus stopping a bit further from failure. Two of these studies here at the bottom we can pretty much ignore because the 𝐷𝐊𝐶𝑒 paper used very low volume single set training. So it might imply that if you're doing a very low volume training plan, maybe going to true failure is more important. But since we also know that volume is a primary driver of growth, that may not be the best plan to follow. And the Nobrega paper looked at going to complete failure, so actually failing versus just below failure. So not really that relevant to what we want to know, but still they found no difference as you'd expect. Now, one very important point is that of the two relevant studies showing a benefit to failure, both were on untrained subjects, which led Greg to conclude that maybe untrained lifters need to go closer to failure than trained lifters, probably because trained lifters are able to reach the point of full motor unit recruitment earlier than untrained lifters do. And this may seem counterintuitive, and it doesn't imply that beginners should always go to failure, but it might suggest that they can benefit more than more well-trained lifters would by going to failure in terms of maximum muscle gain. Now, of the three relevant studies that found no benefit to training to failure, two used more well-trained subjects with at least a year and a half of lifting experience, and when combined with the most recent study from Carroll et al., which found that going to failure was actually worse for growth in subjects with 7.7 years of experience on average, well, it seems that well-trained lifters actually can get away with, or maybe even benefit from, staying a few reps shy of failure. Now, getting back to what Dr. Mike said at the beginning of the video, it may very well be true that the last handful of reps just before failure are more important than reps further from failure. However, based on the data we have as a whole, there probably isn't much difference between leaving a couple reps in the tank and going to the point where you actually fail a rep. So what do I take from all of this? Well, I will say that I do find the effective reps theory pretty compelling, even if it isn't without limitation. Now, one thing I would definitely avoid are pump sets where you're doing 20 plus reps nowhere near failure. Those are probably the closest thing to pointless wasted reps that you can do in the gym. So if you're gonna do high rep work, you really wanna make sure you're getting within at least 2 to 3 reps of failure, if not going all the way to failure. And of course, this type of work should be reserved for single joint isolation exercises. Now, as a general recommendation when it comes to the other stuff, it may be true that for most of your sets, especially on compound lifts, you should probably stay 1 to 3 reps shy of failure, since it'll be safer with similar muscle gains and might allow for higher training volumes as well. But that doesn't also mean that the sets should be easy. True RPE 8 should still feel very difficult. I know some people see results like these as an excuse to be lazy. They assume that just because you can see similar hypertrophy when going to failure versus near failure, that somehow implies that you don't need to train hard. But I actually don't think that's true at all. In my experience training with really well-built guys like John Meadows, and even a real scientist like Eric Helms, I found that there really isn't a way to optimize your program so much that you can get away with not training hard. Now, in isolation work, I'm much more open to training closer to failure and even to failure, and I think things like drop sets and rest pause sets can have merit as well, as long as they're programmed intelligently in the context of a routine that considers not only the training stimulus from a single set, but also the amount of fatigue being imposed from the program as a whole.